I always forget that, even though Jonathan and I just talked about it. So, excuse me, Jonathan Adams, who lives in South Wales, um, and spent some time in London, and he is an architect and he is an author.
Mhm.
And I'd like to welcome Jonathan and hand over to him.
Good afternoon, everyone. Evening here. Good afternoon, you all. I hope you can all hear me clearly enough. As Sue said, I'm an architect and I was born in Wales, grew up in Wales, initially trained here, worked for the first part of my career in London and then moved back to Wales in the late 90s to design the Millennium Centre building in Cardiff, the Opera House in Cardiff. I got interested in the Welsh background of Frank Lloyd Wright much later on, actually around about 2015, 2016, when I was asked by people I knew in BBC Wales if I would help them with a documentary programme they were making about Frank Lloyd Wright from a story being told from a Welsh viewpoint. I'd read biographies of Frank Lloyd Wright by that time and thought I knew a fair bit about him, but as I came to realise that there was a lot that firstly, I didn't know, and secondly, that hadn't really been said by people who'd written about Frank Lloyd Wright up until that point. We had 2 weeks in America visiting all the major Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, and then this came out as a documentary on BBC, which was shown in England as well as in Wales, shown several times. And just through that whole process, I just found myself getting more and more immersed in the story of Frank Lloyd Wright and trying to understand why he was why he behaved in the way he did, the kind of person that he was, and whether his Welsh background had anything to do with that. And that's what the talk is about this evening. So if you're all ready for me to get stuck into it, I'll make a start with it. I guess you can tell if you're reading through. I got lots of pictures, so I hope you can all see the pictures. You can see the slide, and I will be mainly reading from the text that I prepared here. So let's just make sure I get this to work. So Frank Lloyd Wright is the most written about architect of all time. Now, as great as his work was, he was best known as a focus of controversy. He antagonized the establishment, and he seemed to relish upsetting polite society. He was arrested more than once. He was investigated by the FBI. He was arrogant, contrarian, but he was also, without doubt, one of America's very greatest artists. He's first and foremost an American architect, so it's no surprise that all his serious biographies have American authors, and all of them discuss Wright's Welsh roots. They can hardly avoid that, as Wright himself mentioned them so often. A couple of them have made an effort to relate his Welsh roots to his personality, but none of them have done what I've attempted in this book to really join the dots: his Welsh roots, his religious beliefs, his own childhood experience, to reveal the clear map of his creative motivations and methods. His previous biographers have all avoided trying to account for his achievements. It seems enough to say that he was an inexplicable genius, and that his ideas came as if by magic from thin air. And Wright liked to encourage that view himself. He always resisted the suggestion that his work owed anything to earthly influences, but in fact, his achievements owe everything to some distinctive religious and philosophical attitudes, and to an appetite for hard work that were deliberately embedded into his personality during his childhood by his Welsh mother, by his many aunts and uncles, and through them by his grandparents, Richard and Mary Lloyd Jones. In his old age, at the height of his fame, he often took time out to speak to students. He found their enthusiasm life-affirming, and it gave him a good reason to reflect on what was truly important to him in his work. So in 1957, a few years before his 90th birthday, he was at the University of California in Berkeley. He spoke for a while about the responsibilities of the architect and the idea of organic design, and then he moved on to the subject of his childhood. his memories of his ancestors, and the wisdom that he believed had been passed down through them to him. He said, "I want to give you something now that will be worth the evening if I don't succeed in saying anything else. The definition of a genius for you all. A genius is a man who has an eye to see nature.
Jonathan, you're
That happen spontaneously, unfortunately, Sue.
yes. Sorry, could you go back about 30 seconds?
Okay, I'll start with this one here. So I want to give you something now that will be worth the evening if I don't succeed in saying anything else. The definition of a genius for you all. This is Frank Lloyd Wright speaking to these students in 1957 in Berkeley. A genius is a man who has an eye to see nature, a man with a heart to feel nature, and a man with a boldness to follow nature. And this isn't just a proverb, it's a triad. This is an ancient form of a 3-line verse that formed a vital part of Druidic training. And the oldest surviving collection of triads in text form dates from the 13th century, but it's likely that some at least were composed in the Iron Age, and that they were passed on for centuries by word of mouth alone. And the words of this triad, this genius triad, they were first impressed upon Frank Lloyd Wright in his youth, and he believed in them still as a 90-year-old. This is Edward Williams. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He's otherwise known as Iolo Morgannwg. Now, he was the single most influential personality in the Welsh antiquarian revival of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it was he who was most responsible for the identification of Welsh history and literature and arts with bardism, the poetic discipline of the ancient Druids. He's probably best known as the man who created the National Eisteddfod of Wales and the Gorsedd of Bards that flourishes to this day. His most famous composition was the ritual for the induction of bards into the Gorsedd, his Druidic order. This is the ritual that takes place every year at the opening of the National Eisteddfod, a ritual that begins with the word "y gwir yn erbyn y byd," truth against the world. The Genius Triad first appeared in print in 1794 in Iolo Morgannwg's book, Poems, Lyric and Pastoral. This is a book in 2 volumes that has 95 poems in it, the fruits of many years of poetic endeavour and research into Druidic tradition. Many of the poems also addressed radical political themes. Thomas Paine himself, the author of The Rights of Man, was among its subscribers, along with a host of other notable revolutionary figures. And this is Llanwenog Church in South Ceredigion. Llanwenog is an Anglican church, and it was supported for centuries by generations of the Lloyd family. And the Lloyd family has an ancient and prestigious history, particularly in West Wales. It has branches spread right throughout West Wales. They owned thousands of acres of farmland and occupied a large number of stately homes. By the late 18th century, being rural gentry, the Lloyd family was conservative and loyalist in its outlook, supportive of the king in the traditional way. But there's a curious group of headstones in the southwest corner of this churchyard, memorials that seem out of place. While most of them do have connections to the Lloyd family, they're not Anglicans or conservatives. They're all prominent local Unitarians, radicals, rational dissenters, Republicans, people committed by their faith to the overthrow of the English crown. This is one of the Unitarian headstones. It belongs to a man called John Enoch. It's unusual because the bottom half of the slab is taken up by a verse from a hymn, and the name of the author appears at the bottom. You can just see it there, the name is Iolo. So there are plenty of headstones with verses carved into them, but it's rare to see the author of the poem, the verse, accredited like this, the name of Iolo Morgannwg at the bottom of the stone. John Enoch's connection to the Lloyd family was through his wife, Margaret Lloyd. Their family's devotion to Iolo Morgannwg was hugely important to them, and it ran deep. And John Enoch and Margaret Lloyd were Frank Lloyd Wright's great-grandparents. Iolo Morgannwg was far more than a poet and a revolutionary. He was also a very effective missionary for the cause of Unitarianism. In the 1770s, when he was living in London, he had joined the earliest Unitarian congregation in Britain at Essex Street, Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley were fellow members. It was probably Iolo Morgannwg more than anyone else who was responsible for the spectacular growth of Unitarianism in South Ceredigion. Unitarianism is at the heart of this story. It's a set of beliefs that emerged directly from the Enlightenment and which began to flower with the advent of modernity, of scientific discovery, and industrialization. It isn't really a version of Christianity at all because it sees Jesus as an ordinary human. It has little time for superstition or miracles. It's Unitarian because it doesn't believe in the Holy Trinity, no Father, Son, or Holy Ghost. And it takes the view that the Bible must have been written by normal human beings, and as such, it must be as flawed as the people who wrote it. Despite these almost heretical foundations, Unitarians in the 18th and 19th centuries were just as committed and as devout as any other believers. And more than that, because they were scorned and condemned by the established church and by other nonconformist causes, they felt embattled and even oppressed. But this only gave strength to their view that it was them, the Unitarians, who were in possession of the truth, while the rest of society was still stuck in the superstitious past, blindly following derelict religious and social conventions. Unitarianism in Ceredigion traces its roots back to a preacher named Jenkin Jones. Now, Jenkin Jones set up his first chapel in 1733 at a place called Llwynrydowen. It's in South Cardiganshire. This was decades before the advent of Unitarianism, but it was already a radical congregation, led by Jenkin to follow Arminian principles, described by opponents as a faith for the young and the ruffians because it allowed everyone to go to heaven. Now, Jenkin Jones was Frank Lloyd Wright's great-great-great-grandfather, and the name of Jenkin echoes down through the generations that came later. Through the mid-1700s, local interest in the Arminian faith slowly grew, and the radicalism gradually became more extreme. By the late 1700s, there were 4 or 5 chapels in the area, and they'd now moved on from Arminianism to become committed to Arian principles, the most radical of which is that the Holy Trinity does not exist, and that there is only one God whose deity could not be shared. So, in other words, the beginnings of a kind of Unitarian outlook. Still, if it hadn't been for Iolo Morgannwg's intervention, the transition to full Unitarianism may never have occurred. It was Iolo that was chiefly responsible for persuading a young pastor named Charles Lloyd to break away from the Arian church at Llwynrydowen and to set up the first fully Unitarian chapel at Devies a few miles down the road. I mentioned Margaret Lloyd a few minutes ago, the wife of John Enoch, whose headstone had the verse on it by Iolo Morgannwg. Now, Margaret Lloyd was the sister of the pastor Charles. So Charles Lloyd, the brother of Margaret Lloyd, was the first pastor to run a Unitarian chapel in Cardiganshire. So this was in 1802. And Iolo was present at the inauguration of the chapel, and he carved a stone to mark the occasion, which was set into the chapel walls. The 7 trustees of the chapel were central to the celebrations, and these are the people that signed a lease on the property. The trustees included John Enoch and another farmer named Thomas James of Penwern. On this picture, Penwern is at the bottom right corner, and the farm at the upper right is called Panstryman. The Panstryman is the farm that belonged to John Enoch. And they were neighbours at the edge of Athlerodin Estate, that's Athlerodin House in the middle. Athlerodin is one of the grand homes of the Lloyd family. Its owners were distantly related to Margaret Lloyd. A few years after the dedication of Devies Chapel, Thomas James, the trustee of Penwern, would find himself the father of a baby daughter, Mary, who they called Mally. At the dedication of the Devies Chapel, John Enoch and Margaret may even have had with them their 3-year-old son, Richard. So Richard and Mally then grew up on these neighbouring farms, and they continued to attend Devies Chapel. And they also regularly attended the older chapel at Llwynrydowen. They got married in 1829. By that time, Unitarianism in South Ceredigion had flourished to the extent that there was a greater concentration of Unitarian chapels in the area than anywhere else in Britain. As you can see here, 14 of them in a very small area. And it was the Methodists that first referred to the area as Ysmotyn D, the black spot, a disturbing example of what could go wrong if radicals and free thinkers could get a foothold in the community. As you can see from this map, there were the 14 chapels within a few square miles. In 1958, Frank Lloyd Wright gave a speech at a graduation ceremony in New York. By that time, he was 91 years old, and he concluded the speech with these following words: "The principles that build the tree will build the man. That is why I think nature should be spelled with a capital N. Not because nature is God, but because all that we can learn of God, we will learn from the body of God, which we call nature." The belief that nature is the embodiment of God was given powerful expression by Iolo Morgannwg. It was the dominant theme of his first book, Poems, Lyric and Pastoral, and it became a central tenet in Iolo's understanding of Druidism and Unitarianism, the vision of his faith that was passed on to the congregations of Ysmyntyn Dŷ. The presence of God in the beauty and harmony of nature was an obvious truth. But throughout his long life, Iolo Morgannwg pursued another, more elusive truth with relentless determination, and that was the truth of the primacy of the Welsh nation in the Isles of Britain and of the preeminence of her language and poetry. Later in his life, as he became more engaged with the politics and the religion of rebellion, Iolo Morgannwg became a strong advocate for American migration. Like many Welsh Unitarians, he saw in the newly liberated Republic of America the promise of religious and political freedom, a state of liberty that would never be attainable in Wales under English dominion. This is a plan that Iolo made for a Welsh colony in America. Richard and Mary Lloyd-Jones, Frank Lloyd Wright's grandparents, were among the earliest generations to fully inhabit the vision of Wales that Iolo had revealed. And it was this idea of Welsh identity, rooted in ancient history, but forward-looking and radical, that they took with them and their 7 children to America in 1844, along with a vision of a free, progressive Welsh society that they set out to realise on American soil. They were more than merely Welsh. They were Welsh fundamentalists. In his autobiography, Frank Lloyd Wright recalled that his grandfather had a family crest, the old Druid symbol, truth against the world. The symbol was another of Iolo Morgannwg's creations. He referred to it as a nod covering, the mystic mark. But it was the words, truth against the world, that struck the deepest chord. Frank understood their deep meaning. It was a truth that would inevitably bring the believer into direct conflict with the accepted norms of wider society, and that had the power to burn through the shallow pretensions and oppressions of the establishment. Frank died in 1959, aged 92. And a few years later, a letter was found inside a wooden box in the attic of a house in London. The letter had been sent in 1852 by Margaret Lloyd, Frank's grandmother, to her 3rd son, John, Frank's great-grandmother, to her 3rd son, John, who'd been living in London for many years by that time. The letter revealed that of Margaret Lloyd and John Enoch's 11 children, no fewer than 5 had left Wales to settle in America during Margaret's lifetime. She tells John that his father had died just 2 years before, and she then gives him an update on the whereabouts of his brothers and sisters. Rachel and Jenkin, 2 of the younger siblings, had gone to America first, Rachel with a husband and Jenkin on his own. Both had bought land in East Wisconsin. A couple of years later, they were followed by Richard and Mally and their family to add to the land owned by Jenkin and establish a productive farm. She then breaks the news that Jenkin had died only 2 years after Richard's family had arrived there. And she mentions that his sister, Eleanor, Nell, also left for America not long after Richard with her own husband and 10 children and settled in the same area. So she has from 30 to 40 children and grandchildren in America living in the same neighborhood close to Watertown in Wisconsin. You probably know where Watertown is. It's just there on the eastern edge of the state in the Rock River Valley. Richard and Mally went to America because they knew all about the opportunities it offered, the possibility of buying a large area of land for themselves, being sold at giveaway prices by the government to attract settlers into the wilderness, and the chance for them and their children to develop their full potential, unconstrained by the class and language barriers of their homeland. And most of all, the chance to establish a new Unitarian Wales on American soil. In their luggage, they carried a family Bible and a copy of Iolo Morgannwg's Unitarian hymn book, the book in which the nod covering first appeared in print. The hymn book was called Salman yr Eglwys yn yr Anialwch, Songs of the Church in the Wilderness. Considering where they were heading, this title could not have been more appropriate. The mid-1800s were the era of the opening up of the American West. Over the course of a few decades, European migrants flowed in their millions to fill the forests and plains of the continental interior. They were American only in so much as they made homes on American land and lived by American laws. There was little American culture. First Nation people had already been pushed to the margins. There was no society there with which to integrate, so they maintained their native cultural identities and coalesced into expatriate settlements, Germans here and Norwegians there. The Lloyd Joneses, Unitarians from South Cardiganshire, were outcasts by choice, even among compatriots. It wasn't long before they were ostracized by their Methodist neighbours, and they became effectively a settlement unto themselves. But this suited them. It created the ideal conditions in which to distill their heterodox convictions. And it allowed them, by accident or by design, to exclude any contrary thought. Richard and Mally and their 6 surviving children joined their younger brother, Jenkin, where he had settled 2 years before, at the edge of a township called Ixonia in east Wisconsin, a region of forest and swampland. And as their mother had mentioned in their letter, the sisters Rachel and Eleanor were a few miles away at Watertown. The land was cheap, but the quality was poor. Most of the first year was spent cutting trees and digging drainage channels. Jenkin had regular work at a sawmill at Oconomowoc, a 6-mile walk through the forest. Just there on the right-hand side of the map there, you can see it in the circle. Watertown on the left and Ixonia in the middle. He was at the sawmill when he died, and he was killed by malaria. And malaria was rampant in this swampy area of east Wisconsin. The whole family had it, but Jenkin was the only one that spent days at a time next to the water. This is the little Welsh graveyard in Ixonia where Jenkin is buried. The land was originally part of the Lloyd Joneses' farm, and the rest of the land is beyond the trees in the background of the picture. They stayed in Ixonia for 12 years and only left when a new railroad was built directly along the western boundary of their land. It was the railroad that led them to much better land near the township of Spring Green, 90 miles to the west. This map dates from around 25 years after they left Ixonia, and the shaded area was the Lloyd Jones farm, and you can see the railroad running along the boundary. It's noticeable how almost all the other landowners around them still have Welsh names at this point. After a couple of false starts and another 8 years, they eventually settled on the land just south of Spring Green, across the Wisconsin River, that would become the cherished Lloyd Jones Valley, the Valley of the God Almighty Joneses, as it became known. They moved there in early 1865, the year that the Civil War ended. Now, if you've read any of the biographies that have been published since Robert Twombley's in 1973, you will have been told that Hannah, Frank Lloyd Wright's mother, never amounted to much, or worse. To Brendan Gill, author of the Wright biography Many Masks, she was ambitious, half-mad, sexually cold, and drearily self-righteous. And her husband William made but one single irredeemable error in his long lifetime, which was consenting to marry her. Donald Johnson, author of many Wright books and essays, believes that the genetic and practical source of Frank's artistic genius and intellectual fervour was his father. Paul Hendrickson, a much more recent biographer, is just as blunt. He says, "The vote here will always be cast for William and against the cruel Anna, a woman who, with her awful and inborn temper, with her terrifying will, suffered a prolonged siege of mental illness, which, of course, if it were true, would mean that we should not take it seriously." These insults came about because, as Meryl Sechrest says in her definitive biography, which was published in 1992, nothing is known of her life as a young woman. There was a vacuum into which decades of male American biographers could project their prejudices. And also, importantly, from my point of view, our point of view, is that it's given American biographers a reason to cut Frank off from the influence of his Welsh roots and to assert that everything he achieved came from his father alone, a third-generation English migrant. a real American, in other words. So what you see again and again in American accounts of his life is that his Welsh family is barely mentioned. And even when they are referred to, it's in ambivalent, uncomprehending or disparaging terms. Now, none of this ever rang true to me. It's just not representative of what we know of the Lloyd Joneses of a family. And sure enough, it only required a little digging on my part to find out that it is indeed completely untrue. Hannah's younger brother, Jenkin, was the only member of the family who fought in the Civil War. He was in his late teens when he enlisted. He kept a diary of his time on the battlefront, and much later in his life, when he'd become famous as a leader of the Unitarian Church, the diary was published, unedited, and in it he always mentions his happiness at receiving letters from his brothers and sisters. And on several occasions he mentioned that he was worried about Hannah and her stressful situation, and he once mentions, just once, he mentions the name of a place, Albion. And when I searched 19th century maps for a place in Wisconsin called Albion, I found a tiny township around 60 miles east of Spring Green. The only building of any note in the town was called Albion Academy, and it turned out that this was the first co-educational college of higher education in the entire state of Wisconsin. It was established by Seventh-day Adventists from Norway, and it had opened its doors only 5 years before Hannah enrolled, and she enrolled there on a degree course. This was a course of at least 5 years. It was an extremely intense training, aimed at preparing graduates for senior careers in education. And she was among the earliest female cohorts in the Midwest to graduate from higher education. This is a clipping from the Seventh-day Adventist newspaper, the Sabbath Recorder. She's referred to at the graduation ceremony in June 1865, reading an essay with self-possession and refined modesty. And she's listed here among the other graduates, laureate of philosophy. Only 7 made it through the full course that year, out of a year group of over 100. So the established account that Hannah prevailed upon William Wright to marry him is untrue. It was the other way around. It was she that was the more capable in every way, and he needed more. He needed her more than she needed him. His first wife, Pamelia, had died in childbirth in 1864, 2 years before he married Hannah. Until her death, Pamelia had cared for their 3 children single-handedly, as was the conservative norm, and he needed a new wife to take on those duties. Shortly after her graduation, Hannah had been appointed head of Spring Green School. From William's viewpoint, the marriage would have been beneficial in every way, but for Hannah, it was a Faustian pact. The marriage bar was a strict expectation among the professional class, which they both aspired to represent. She knew that once she married, she would have to give up her teaching ambitions, the very ambitions that had carried her through years of rigorous college education. So why did she agree to marry him? At the time she met him, he was working as a lawyer at the township of Lone Rock, just west of Spring Green. No legal qualification was required at the time to join the bar, and he didn't have one. He was also serving a 2-year elected stint as a superintendent of schools in Richland County. It was a post for which there was not much competition, but it did confer a degree of authority and prestige. So presumably what she would have expected to gain in compensation was the promise of security, even prosperity, and most compellingly, it would allow her to have children of her own, who would share the benefits of a stable and comfortable upbringing. She made no reference after her marriage to her time at Albion Academy. It was an aspect of her past that she seems deliberately to have erased. She also changed her name from Hannah to Anna. As I mentioned, they married in the summer of 1866. The exact date isn't known. Frank was born in June 1867 in this house in the town of Richland Centre, about 15 miles from Lone Rock, where they had married. This was the first house move. Within the year, William had given up his legal practice to become a Baptist minister. Now, that must have seemed risky, although the ministers in Hannah's family were regarded with the highest respect. And then before Frank's 11th birthday, his family had moved another 6 times, from west to east and back again. Each time his father had been taken on as a minister, and then within a couple of years, he had either resigned because of his failure to gain the support of his congregation, or he'd been pushed out. As Frank put it in his autobiography, his pastoral career was a story of failure upon failure. You can see here all the places they lived between 1867 and 1877. William's problem was that he was obsessed with music, writing music and performing music. He even made musical instruments. It doesn't take much reading between the lines to work out that he went into the ministry largely because it gave him more time for music and an audience to perform to. He had less time for the basic demands of fundraising and church building, and he had little time for his children. This suited Anna, who devoted the whole of her considerable intellect to their upbringing and to Frank in particular. They eventually settled in Madison, capital of Wisconsin, in 1877. They were able to do it for two reasons. Firstly, because William had converted to Unitarianism, so that he could rely on Anna's brother Jenkin to find work for him. Jenkin was, as I mentioned, the Unitarian leader at the time. Secondly, because Anna's brothers had agreed to buy a house for her family. The house was here, under the number 1 there on the top right, on the shore of Lake Mendota, a beautiful spot. The Second Ward School was very nearby. Frank's Aunt Jenny got a senior teaching job there at the same time, said by number 2. So she was probably also sharing the house with them at that time. They were about 60 miles from the Lloyd-Jones Valley. Anna introduced a big change into Frank's young life as soon as they settled in Madison. From the age of 11 onwards, when the summer came, she sent him to live and work at the valley on her brother James's farm. During those summers, he would be immersed in a culture and a lifestyle that was indistinguishable from Unitarian South Cardiganshire. At this time in his life, it is certain that he lived with the Welsh language. He understood it and responded to it. This is the family of Richard and Mary Lloyd-Jones, photographed in 1883. The photo shows all of their children and grandchildren. Mally had died 10 years earlier, and the family would gather together every year on the anniversary of her death. That's her empty seat in the centre, next to Richard, the patriarch. Frank was 16 years old, and that's him right next to Mally's empty seat. His mother and father are just behind him. His father with the white beard. He's the oldest person in the group, apart from grandfather Richard. And Frank was effectively homeschooled by these people throughout his childhood, by his mother Anna, by his aunties Nell and Jenny, by his uncle James, and by this whole rich cast of characters that made up their agricultural, Welsh-speaking, Druidic Unitarian clan. He benefited from a remarkably progressive, free and natural education. He was widely read at a young age, but also encouraged to learn systematically and directly from the natural world. He came to understand that creativity was a divine gift and that he could be a vessel for its expression. And just as naturally, they taught him to distrust convention and to resist anyone who tried to constrain him to their rules. And most significantly, he admired the resilience and bravado of this family, their conviction that it was they were the possessors of the truth and that everyone else was wrong. The picture here is an example of a typical wealthy middle-class home in the late 1800s, in this case in Philadelphia. This was the dominant taste of the day, just to give us a bit of context. Frank's uncle Jenkin was a very capable missionary and fundraiser for the Unitarian cause. Within 10 years of being ordained, he had risen to become secretary of the Western Unitarian Conference, with responsibilities of the whole of the Middle and Western United States. In 1882, he took a break from his missionary work to go back to his birthplace in Wales. This was a photograph taken at that time by his colleague, I can't remember the colleague's name unfortunately, who took a camera with them to record Jenkin's visit to Pantydefaid Chapel. Jenkin preached here and also at Llanryd Owen during his visit. As you can see, one of the most striking aspects of this chapel is that it bears no resemblance to a religious building. It looks like a house. The photograph is from a book called Youngest Son, which was written and self-published in 1938 by Chester Lloyd-Jones. He was a successful diplomat, and his father was Enos Lloyd-Jones. Enos was the youngest son of Richard and Mally, the last of the children born, and he was born in America. Now, this picture has been reproduced several times in academic papers in America, and they've all assumed that the caption printed on it in the book is accurate, and it obviously isn't. Llanderfai Chapel made a deep impression on Jenkyn Lloyd-Jones. When he returned to America, he gave up his missionary role and he settled in Chicago with the aim of reviving a declining Unitarian congregation there and of building a new church that he called All Souls. In a sermon called The New Problems in Church Architecture, he set out his vision for this new church, and he asked for a new type of meeting house that could accommodate the finer ideals of many smaller homes, where those of like mind and taste band together with home-like ties. And he concluded his sermon with a plea directly to those that he felt should respond. Build us, O architect, a building whose very walls will be instinct with human fellowship and human needs. Flood it with sunlight, fill it with pure air. He was a supremely articulate and persuasive advocate for progressive transformation, who, through a decade of preaching in churches across America, had arrived at a deep understanding of the power of architecture to influence human behavior and to be a vehicle for social change. So in this sermon, it also reveals a note of respect for the architectural profession that suggests it was probably his uncle Jenkyn who played the main part in guiding his young nephew towards it. This is All Souls Church, Chicago, built to Jenkyn's specification, and Jenkyn and his family lived on the upper floors. As you can see, it looks more like a house than a place of worship, much bigger than the little chapel in Llanderfai, but still not recognisably a church. The architect of All Souls Church was another Unitarian named Joseph Silsby. And while Silsby worked on All Souls, Jenkyn gave him another smaller project, a family chapel for the Lloyd-Joneses, which was to be built in their Wisconsin Valley. This is the Lloyd-Jones Chapel, known as Unity Chapel. It was completed and dedicated in the summer of 1886, soon after Frank Lloyd Wright's 19th birthday. Frank had spent that summer with the Lloyd-Joneses at the Valley, as he had always done. And he was present during the construction of the chapel. And we know that he was personally responsible for the decoration of its ceilings. This is the inside of the chapel now. I just want to point out something while we're on this picture. Just notice at the top, you can see a curtain rail with rings on it. That comes up in a second. It's significant. At the time, he was a student at a university in Madison studying engineering, but he never flourished there. And before the end of the first year, he'd given it up. And between his mother and his uncle Jenkyn, a more direct career pathway had been arranged. By January of 1887, he was settled in Chicago, lodging with his uncle Jenkyn at All Souls, and working as an apprentice in the office of Joseph Silsby, his uncle's architect. Entering young adulthood in Chicago in the late 1880s, he was fortunate to find himself in the right place at the right time. The city was booming, but he was just one young architect among many. The work that survives from this early apprenticeship is typical of an architectural novice. Nothing special about it at all, and yet within a decade of taking those first steps, he was among the most progressive architects in the world. This is the earliest surviving Frank Lloyd Wright design for a Unitarian chapel in Sioux City. Amazingly, it was accepted and published by the Chicago journal Inland Architect in June 1887. This is a close-up of the plan of Frank's Sioux City chapel, and next to it, the plan of Silsby's Unity Chapel. As you can see, they're essentially the same. Notice the way that they have two main spaces that can be used as one, and the two spaces were divided by a curtain. This was part of Jenkyn Lloyd-Jones's brief to Silsby for the design of Unity Chapel, and that idea was copied from Llanderfai Chapel, as Jenkyn had found it in 1882. The scale and proportions and plan form are very similar. This is a building from late in Frank's career, the first Unitarian meeting house in Madison, completed in 1951 when Frank was 84. Now, the scale and proportions and plan form are very different from the 19th century chapels, but he still designed the two main spaces to flow together, and it was still considered a radical thing to do at that time, and they were divided by a long curtain. And this was a deliberate statement on his part, a homage. You can see the curtain in the background of this photo. And so there's a lineage that extends from this mid-20th century American church all the way back to an early 19th century Cardingershire chapel. Frank had worked for Joseph Silsby for less than a year before he left to join the firm of Adler and Sullivan, where he worked closely alongside Louis Sullivan, the most progressive architect in Chicago. And this was the crucial stage of his development into the architect that he would become. Sullivan really trusted Frank and was very close to him, came to regard him as a protege. He even lent Frank $5,000, which Frank used to build his own house in Oak Park, the aspirational suburb where he lived with his mother, Anna, and Kitty, his young wife. And this was the first completed building of Frank Lloyd Wright's own design, a startling mix of pure geometry and flowing internal space. It brought in plenty of inquiries, and in 1893 he split from Lewis Sullivan to set up his own practice for the first time. He was just 26 years old. Commissions arrived in abundance. Within a few years, Wright houses could be seen on most of the main streets in Oak Park and scattered through the prosperous suburbs of Chicago. As his upbringing dictated, he always pushed boundaries, always defied convention, and always unsettled his neighbours with the jarringly new. It's a couple of the houses that he built around that time. His approach to the running of his office was also highly unconventional, a fact that American biographers have struggled to explain. This is how Frank's relationship with his staff was described by the writer Norris Smith. They formed a quasi-familial group of devoted followers, their relationship to him marked by loyalty and a devotion to certain ideas. They were taken on as members, not as hirelings. They were not members of his family, but they belonged to his household, an entity that had somehow to embrace within its pattern of order all that was socially meaningful. And another biographer, called Grant Manson, was just as baffled. This is what he said. There was a studio workshop proper, with its carefully planned professional facilities, apart but connected. There were the apprentices or draftsmen working more or less en famille, taking lunch daily with the patron and his family. It's life in a continental vein, strangely alien to American custom. Where did it come from? It's only one of many things about Wright's mode of living, which was established at the same early date, that defy explanation. Now, it can, in fact, be quite easily explained. Among the words of Smith and Manson is almost perfectly expressed the definition of tidy. It's the traditional form of Welsh rural household, and it was the way of life that Frank had found among the Lloyd Joneses at the Valley. He thought of it as the right way to live, paternalistic, but also wholesome, egalitarian, and communal, as they brought it with them from Wales and as it had been practiced by their ancestors for countless generations before. For the whole of his life, Frank organised his life along these lines as much as he could. He was never comfortable other than at the heart of a multi-generational communal group, and he believed for his whole existence that the best life could only be lived out in the countryside, immersed in nature. In 1901, 8 years after he began his practice, Frank's aunts Jenny and Nell Lloyd Jones commissioned Frank to design a new school building located in the Lloyd Jones Valley in Wisconsin, where he'd spent every summer of his teenage years. Jenny and Nell owned and ran the school. Hillside Home School, still there, it's an extraordinarily modern work, showing what he could do when given complete creative freedom. When you look at this, you have to remind yourself that this is a building of the late Victorian age. The hall is the most impressive space in the school. It has a square plan, with the gallery set at 45 degrees to the outside of the building, just like the pattern on this 19th century quilt, very typical of the visual culture of rational descent. And all around the gallery, there are carvings of the nod covering symbol. The two aunts were not just highly intellectual Unitarians, they still subscribed to the bardism of Iolo Here's the cover of one of the yearbooks, and like every one of the yearbooks, it carries the school motto, Anenu Poib Dione, in the name of God and all goodness, a line taken directly from Iolo's bardic initiation ritual. It was the design of Unity Temple just 2 years later that really established him at the forefront of American architecture. And Wright designed the building to replace his local Unitarian church after it had been destroyed by a lightning strike. Unity Temple is a complete reimagining of what a religious building could be. American Unitarian churches typically have steeples, the one that was destroyed had a steeple, or they had towers, or sometimes a dome, but this one has no vertical gesture, or portico, or even a front door where you'd expect it to be, and neither does it resemble a house. And the whole structure, inside and out, is cast in reinforced concrete. Frank's justification for using concrete was that it was cheap. It was a utilitarian material used for low-grade engineering works. He knew that the church committee had a limited budget, so they reluctantly went along with it. But his real reason for using concrete was that it was a new and exciting technology, and very few buildings had been built in solid concrete at that time, and he knew no one else in his profession would consider using it for a church. It gave him the perfect justification to think the unthinkable. The inventiveness of the exterior is just the start. When you go in, you're led in through side doors into a foyer, and from there into a low passage. And then you have to turn and mount some steps in this dark, restricted space before you emerge beneath a low, overhanging gallery, and you're then released into a beautiful, open, top-lit room. Even for a non-believer, the sense of spiritual elevation is quite profound. A striking feature of the temple is the way that the congregation enters and leaves the sanctuary through doors at each side of the pulpit. In his autobiography, which he wrote 30 years after this, he explained his thought process. He said, should the pulpit face the street and let the congregation come in and go out at the rear in the usual disrespectful church fashion? No. Why not put the pulpit at the rear and bring the congregation in at the sides? And when the congregation rose to disperse, here was an opportunity to move forwards towards their pastor. And by swinging wide doors open beside the pulpit, let the flock pass out by the minister. But nothing springs fully formed from nowhere. So where did he find his inspiration for this extraordinary space? One of the buildings that his family remembered with absolute clarity from their Welsh home was the old Unitarian chapel at Lloyd. It had become fully Unitarian while Richard and Mary Lloyd-Jones were still youngsters. It was built by their ancestors, and it represented everything good that they felt they stood for. His uncle Jenkin had preached there at Lloyd in 1882, and in 1900, his mother and his sister had also travelled to Wales and had seen the chapel for themselves. So this was only 2 years before he started designing Unity Temple. You can imagine Frank asking them to describe it to him in detail. Just as at Unity Temple in Chicago, here at Lloyd, the entrance doors are away from the street, and the congregation enters at the sides with the low overhanging gallery pressing down on their heads. And the pulpit is located at the back in between the doors. The space between the galleries is square. This is one of Frank's earliest presentation drawings of the sanctuary of Unity Temple. Around the bottom edge of the gallery parapet, there's an inscribed verse from the book of Isaiah. This was his grandfather's favourite biblical verse. It didn't make it into the finished building, but what it does show is that he was intending that the building would be a homage again to his Welsh ancestors. There is another striking feature that leaves no doubt that the Unity Temple is a homage to the Unitarian chapels of his ancestral homeland. Here's the interior of Lloyd Chapel again. There are nonconformist chapels all over Britain with a similar arrangement of doors on each side of the pulpit. They're not unique to Wales, but the one feature that is uniquely Welsh is this arrangement of chairs around the pulpit. This is called the Sedd Fawr, big seat. And this is where the deacons and the senior members of the congregation would be seated on long benches, fenced in behind a timber railing. In some of the Methodist chapels, they were very grand, but at Lloyd and in other Unitarian chapels, they were much more modest. Now, in America, around the turn of the century, this is what a typical Unitarian pulpit would look like. This is a Unitarian chapel in church in New York City. And compare that to this, the pulpit at Unity Temple. It's unmistakably Sedd Fawr. Part 3, about Taliesin, the house, and the legendary Welsh poet and hero. In his autobiography, Frank devoted more space to Unity Temple than he did to any other project, recalling the intense effort that he demanded of himself to achieve a sense of balance and resolution in the forms and lines, while still pushing his architecture as far as he could into the future. But in September of 1909, when the congregation of Unity Temple convened for the dedication of the new building, Frank wasn't with them. A few days earlier, he'd walked away from his wife and his 6 children, and he'd gone to New York, where he met Maynard Cheney, the wife of one of his Oak Park clients, and from there they took a ship to Europe. It would have been much easier to follow middle-class convention, stay with their families, and allow their relationship to play out discreetly in the background. But for Frank to do that would be to betray his most deeply held principles, the principles of truth against the world. In other words, if he'd stayed with his family, he would have been living a lie. So it was in the interests of his children, in his mind, that he should act with integrity, even if that meant him leaving them for the love of another woman. They spent most of their time in Europe living in a small villa on the outskirts of Florence, a town called Fiesole. Tuscany had a huge impact on Frank's architectural thinking. He wrote freely for the first time of his admiration for the local vernacular architecture, untutored architecture, a romantic principle that he'd always followed. In words that might have come from the pen of Iolo Morgannwg a century before, he said, "As elsewhere, the true basis for any serious study of the art of architecture is in those indigenous structures, the more humble buildings everywhere, which are to architecture what folklore is to literature or folk songs are to music, and with which architects were seldom concerned." He went back to America in October 1910, moved back into his family home and tried to revive his business. He'd left Maynard Cheney in Europe. He moved back into his family home and tried to revive his practice within a community which now thought of him, above all, as a notorious adulterer. He took any small project he could find, and he tried hard to convince everyone that his relationship with Mrs. Cheney was over. But discreetly, the following spring, he made a visit to Spring Green, Wisconsin, around 200 miles from Chicago, where he had bought a tract of rough, stony land just at the end of the Lloyd Jones Valley, where he'd spent all those summers of his youth. And it was here that he began planning the house he called Taliesin, the extraordinary rural estate that would become his home for the rest of his long life. The earliest drawings show a building roughly a crucifix in plan, aligned just below, parallel with the ridge, divided at the crossway by a covered courtyard in the form of a loggia. And to the east, the left-hand side of the picture here, were large living spaces, 2 bedrooms on the ground floor and smaller guest rooms on the lower level. And work areas extended to the west, the largest of them a drafting studio. As the plans developed during the summer of 1911, they grew to include staff bedrooms, stabling for horses, a barn and a milking parlour with a Belvedere dovecote. The building extended from the foot of the initial crucifix to wrap around and along the curves of the hill. In some places, rugged retaining walls branched out to support terrace gardens. In others, the roof lines merged into the original stony contours. It was conceived in the spirit of the ancient hilltop farmsteads that impressed him so deeply in his months in Tuscany. 40 years later, in May 1953, Frank gave a televised interview, which was viewed by many millions of Americans. He was 86 years old and at the height of his fame. And after a discussion of the meaning of organic architecture, Mike Wallace, the interviewer, turned to the subject of the architect's own house. He said, "Where did the name Taliesin come from?" "My people were Welsh," Frank replied. "My mother's people were Welsh immigrants. They were the cultivated element in the county. They all had Welsh names for their places, so I chose a Welsh name for mine, and it was Taliesin, a member of King Arthur's Round Table, who sang the glories of fine art. I guess he was about the only Britisher who ever did." Frank's comments in this TV interview were scripted in advance. And when he said that Taliesin was about the only Britisher that ever did sing the praises of fine art, it was not the spontaneous dig at the old world that it might appear. Taliesin was a great poet, and more importantly, according to Frank, he had been prepared to stand out as a lone voice in defense of a precious culture. But actually, there's nothing in the folklore or history of Taliesin that depicts him in a role of that kind. Frank seems to have been speaking about somebody else. And it was actually Iolo Morgannwg who had written, "I have been trained in a cultural institution that could be traced back to primitive times, in a bardic school, and I am the last of the bardic teachers. So the figure of the lone defender is not Taliesin at all. It's actually Iolo Morgannwg, the rebellious poet and the Welsh fundamentalist revered by Frank's ancestors, the writer who had in fact retrieved Taliesin from history. In Frank's understanding of his inherited mythology, it's as if Taliesin and Iolo Morgannwg had merged into one person. Frank had been raised to aspire to Iolo's heroism, to Taliesin's heroism. He moulded himself in their image, creator and defender of the only true American architecture. The lowest point in Frank's life came in the August of 1914. He built Taliesin as a home for himself and his partner, Maima Cheney. By that time, she divorced from her first husband and was called Maima Borthwick again. While he was working back in Chicago on Midway Gardens, a member of his staff at Taliesin suffered a mental breakdown, and he murdered Maima and her 2 young children and 4 other members of the household, and he set fire to the house. It was almost completely destroyed. The tragedy was made worse by the gleeful response from the press and from the pulpits, all of those who had persecuted him for daring to leave his family and for the love of another woman. And they assumed that he was broken, and that they would never hear from him again. He'd never recover, so he had to prove them wrong. Rebuilding began spontaneously. Even as the debris was being cleared, he found himself driven to rebuild Taliesin in order to rebuild and recover himself, and come to associate himself deeply with the identity of Taliesin, almost as if he felt himself to be an incarnation of the mythical shapeshifter and poetic genius, that there could be no doubt in the resemblance, the artistic brilliance, endurance, the ability to evolve, to adapt, and always to stay ahead of the game by way of staying aside. And regardless of the most harrowing blows, always prevail. He designed a new Taliesin around the limestone mainstays of the first house, the chimneys, the plinths, and the cross walls that had survived the fire. As you can see here, the stone in places had been turned from gold to pink by the heat of the flames. He added more art, more space for fireplaces and courtyards and cliff-like walls. There were new, larger workrooms and farm enclosures, and for the first time, an apartment for his mother. The second Taliesin would be more than twice the size of the first. As the new Taliesin was resolved, Frank was himself reassembled. Life and work became possible again. His greatest achievements were still far ahead of him. A small article appeared in the Racine Journal-Times on the 17th of November 1915 under the heading, "Wright Love Bungalow is Rebuilt." Frank Lloyd Wright's bungalow at Hillside is about rebuilt and will soon be completed. The new building is similar to the one destroyed by the fire last summer. The only difference is that the structure is larger. It will be fully equal, if not surpass the beauty of the old building. Taliesin was back, Frank was back, and both were bigger, bolder, and stronger than before. The great Welsh writer Emyr Humphreys once reflected on the efforts that had been made by English scholars to make the ancient Taliesin part of their own history before Iolo Morgannwg restored him to Welsh history. And he might have been writing about Frank Lloyd Wright. There were attempts to tame him, he said, but he wriggled free with a shapeshifter's ease. Diolch yn fawr. I can see the applause, but I can't hear it, but I accept it all the less. Very much appreciated.
Well, thank you so much. I learnt so much, and that symbol that you see there, I had no idea. So thank you for not only entertaining us, but instructing us and describing his life in those words and his Welsh connections. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm sure we have some questions. If anyone would like to turn their sound on and ask a question, please put your hand up.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you very much.
My hand is up. Luann Broad, Annapolis, Maryland.
Go ahead, Luann.
I have a degree in historic preservation, so all things architecture are wonderful for me, and this was a great program. Unfortunately, I did tune in a little late, but I'll look forward to seeing the recording. Have you heard of Polymath Park in Acme, Pennsylvania?
I have to admit, I haven't. Tell me about it.
Please look it up. It is a home. Let me phrase this correctly.
Polymath Park.
Yes. One of Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices became an architect, and he built 2 houses that are there.
Okay.
A couple bought it, and 2 of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses, the Duncan House and the Mandalay House, were at risk of demolition. The Duncan was, and they were taken apart and put on this property and rebuilt. It's an amazing story. And my brother, a couple years ago, we saw it on CBS Sunday Morning. I can look up the link and send it to Susan for distribution. But it tells all about the project. And my brother, for my birthday, which is right at Christmas, decided that it would be a great present for me to spend the night in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. So we went to Polymath Park and spent the night in the Duncan house. We walked in, we took a tour first of all the houses and then went for our overnight accommodation. And I walked in and my mouth just dropped. And I've been to a couple of his other places. I've seen the high rise in Oklahoma. But I was just astounded. And we just sat there in the chairs and mused about the great architect and his thinking and how radical his ideas were for housing. But it was beautiful. So I would just encourage people to look up Polymath Park.
Could I ask you something, Luann? Did you say the 2 houses had been under threat of demolition, but they were dismantled and rebuilt on this?
Yes, and they tell the story of the dismantling. I mean, it was done with great care.
Yeah, I bet.
And just incredible.
I think it's interesting that I think you begin to hear more about that being done as a means of preserving Wright buildings.
Well, he built a lot in natural areas, but over time, our natural areas have given away to suburbs and exurbs, as they call them. Yeah. And they were, they were houses, so they weren't really the way he designed them. Great, with smaller rooms and smaller hallways, not great for some kind of repurpose or reuse in that same kind of strip shopping center. Yeah. Which I'll take a deep breath and not say anything super nasty about. But I would encourage people to look it up because it does give you 2 of his houses to see and 2 of the his apprentices that did it.
Just to jump in, one of our attendees, Mark, says that it was on our CBS morning show this morning, those houses. So anyone who has that recorded or can look it up.
Then that's maybe they
story.
Yeah, maybe they reran it because
can I just interject? I'm sorry, it was called CBS Morning Show, but not this morning. I wrote that incorrectly.
Okay.
But Luann, I saw that on television, and I think it's been made into a documentary, but I might like Netflix, but I'm not sure of that either.
Oh, I'll look that up. We saw it a couple years ago.
Okay.
I'll send the link, but it was CBS Sunday Morning that we saw it on.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Any other questions?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Who's talking right now?
This is Art.
Okay, Art, go ahead.
Yeah. This is interesting. It was great. This is a presentation that's also illustrative of the general tone of American history, what partly laid the groundwork too for the rise of the Unitarian Church in the United States came out of the Age of Reason. That's why I get very angry and upset to say that particularly with the United States started with the Mayflower or with Virginia. George Washington's chaplain was a Universalist minister by the name of John Murray, who had gone to seminary in Wales, and he had been ostracized, of course, as a heretic. After his wife and child died, he came to the what would become the United States and became the chaplain of the Continental Army. He had to leave because of illness. He went back to Gloucester, Massachusetts, and stood up to the Puritan, the Calvinist establishment, and said, I do not believe in paying a pew tax for beliefs with which I do not agree with. And he got the pew tax repealed. That's why you always hear all the time, and sometimes you read in the basement, in the records of old churches, these Puritan ministers yelling and screaming about the Universalists and the Unitarians taking their monopoly away from them. But that goes far back, and it has, as a root, came to what made America is actually its intellectual elite, Frank Lloyd Wright being an example, or in the arts. And those, of course, are under attack now. But it started with John Murray, not with the Mayflower. And it's interesting because he went to seminary in Wales. Root and the branch, truth against the world. And all that you can only accomplish that with freedom and individualism. Great presentation.
Thank you very much. I think just to add to that, the chances are if you went to a seminary in Wales, that it's probably the same seminary that Jenkins Jones went to, because it was the only one that was teaching progressive.
Yes,
at the time, in Carmarthen.
I think so.
Oh. Yeah.
Wonderful. Gosh. Well, we have a few Unitarians in our Welsh society. I'm sure few of them found this very interesting, to find those connections. Thank you.
I certainly did. I don't know where my little yellow hand is, because
it's okay.
this is a totally new Zoom presentation. But yes, I was aware that Frank Lloyd Wright had Unitarian leanings, or if not roots, and he was I'm not going to say the inspiration, but the architect Victor Lundy, who designed our Unitarian Society in Hartford here, was linked with him in the popular media as being in the same genre, if you can call it that, of progressive natural architecture.
What's the architect's name again, Christina?
I'm sorry?
Could you tell me the name again of the architect who designed the Hartford Unitarian Society?
Yes, Victor Lundy, Lundy.
Victor Lundy. All right. I'll look him up.
He died earlier this year at age 1.
Oh dear. Okay. Yeah.
But we have quite a, I would say, an unusual, if not unique, building, which attracts quite a bit of attention by people.
No, I'm looking forward to looking it up. I think yeah, the Unitarian connection is so strong all the way through Frank Lloyd Wright's career, but there's so much more I could have said about it, put it that way. And I think one of the important parts, oh my gosh, yes, look at that.
Yes.
one of the important parts is the thinking about the conversation we were just having about the early part early Unitarianism in America, not as long back as John Murray, but the first Unitarian churches set up in New England, in Boston, in the 1780s. And the connection with Ralph Waldo Emerson, because Emerson's father obviously was the minister of the first Unitarian church there, and Emerson's influence on Wright is enormous. And there's a whole other, I got a whole other talk I could do about that. You being American, be far more familiar with Emerson than I am, but all the messages about self-reliance that are in the first series of essays of Emerson, those the whole, not just Frank Lloyd Wright, but the whole Lloyd George family deeply, deeply believed in all that. They really, really did sign up for it in a big way. And I know in Anna's case, that Emerson remained her favorite author pretty much her whole life. So that bit about self-reliance, that's also a very strong part of the personality of Frank.
Yes. Yes. Well, I want to thank you for this presentation, and I'm looking forward to seeing it again on the website and also passing it around to a few of my friends. So
yes, it was wonderful. Thank you. I put 2 things in the chat.
Yes.
Oh, some links. Yes, thank you, Luann. I can see those now.
I don't know if everybody can copy them, but one is to that CBS program. The other is directly to Polymath Park. Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you, Susan, too, for arranging.
Oh, you're very welcome. We do have to end now, but I really want to thank everybody for joining, and especially to you, Jonathan. And I look forward to maybe doing something in the future too.
I'd love to. I'd love to.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been a great pleasure to meet you all, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. We found it interesting.
Yes,
wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Out.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye, so.
Thank you.